One Soviet soldier fired a AK-47 and shot one of the ETs. Beam of light came out of the craft and hit a Soviet Jeep, totally vaporizing the Jeep. There wasn't anything left of that Jeep. They were able to open up the hatch on the ET craft, the UFO, and capture the four entities or four ETs and take them into their custody. How someone or something or some entity could do that
Today on Cosmic Disclosure, we are with Richard Doty, a retired special agent who served in the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Richard was intimately involved with UFO ET-related intelligence. Today, we are going to discuss an extraterrestrial incident in the Soviet Union. Richard, welcome.
Thank you, Emery. Good to be here.
It's not often we learn about ET-related incidents from the former Soviet Union. What can you share with us from your investigations?
In January of 1985, there was an incident that occurred in Soviet Union near a Soviet ICBM base, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Base in southeastern Soviet Union. It's called 𝗪𝗓𝗧. A couple days earlier, the Soviet radar picked up something that was traveling from Siberia or southwest. There were several objects actually were tracked by Soviet radar and also Soviet interceptors, but they were never able to actually get close enough to these two objects. Sometime later, on the 12th, an extraterrestrial craft landed near a Soviet ICBM base. And the U.S. Intelligence Service had a control agency contact. We call them CAC, but they were spies. They were working for the United States government. And that spy reported back to us this incident that occurred.
Why they, pick this specific missile base?
I don't know that the Soviets knew, or we figured out, or our spy there on scene figured out why. And we learned more later, but at the time it landed and it was confronted by Soviet military and security personnel. And occupants got out of this craft and the Soviet military personnel engaged them. One Soviet soldier fired an AK-47 and shot one of the ETs. The other three picked up their wounded comrade and took him back inside the craft. As the craft was taken off, Soviet military personnel fired at the craft, and the craft ended up crashing. But a beam of light came out of the craft and hit a Soviet Jeep, totally vaporizing the Jeep. There wasn't anything left of that Jeep, according to our source. So then the Soviet military personnel, after the craft crashed, they were able to open up the hatch on the ET craft, the UFO, and capture the four entities or four ETs and take them into their custody.
What did this craft look like, and what did the ETs look like?
The craft was a circular shaft about 30 feet in diameter. It was described in meters, but equivalent of 30 feet in diameters. It had a hatch on the bottom, had oval shape on top, oval shape on top, bottom, typical UFO craft that people have seen. There was a hatch that opened with stairs coming out. It was a matted gray in color. The ETs were about 3'5" tall. They had on a tight-fitting gray suit, similar, they referred to as a gray flight suit. They had longer arms, no thumbs. They each had helmets with a nozzle from the front to the back, and they had a small tank on the back, similar to something that they might be having to breathe. But they were taken into custody and were taken to another Soviet base some distance away. The Soviets spent a lot of time trying to interrogate these entities by speaking Russian. They used all sorts of languages, Russian, English, Spanish, Czech, and these entities wouldn't communicate or couldn't communicate. They tried everything. They sent some linguists in from Moscow that spoke other languages, but they couldn't communicate at all using any of the different various languages. I think there were 11 or 12 different languages they used. The Soviets didn't really know what to do with him. The one that they had shot was dead. It was dead. Soviet physicians tried to revive it, tried to care for it, but they didn't know the anatomy. It was really hopeless. These entities were transported to another facility, a detention center, and housed there. 4 days later, these entities disappeared. The Soviet military personnel that were guarding these entities saw them in their cells in a detention area, and then when they turned their backs, the entities disappeared. They, of course, searched for them, couldn't find them. The entity's craft was at another location some distance away, about 20 kilometers away. So the Soviet personnel went to that crash, the hangar housing this craft, and that disappeared too.
Could you elaborate a little bit more, why they landed right there at that particular point?
First of all, let me explain. The Soviet ICBM missiles are not controlled like our ICBM missiles are in the United States. The Soviet military personnel didn't have complete control over every one of their missiles. There had to have been a launch control personnel at launch control facilities close to the missiles in order to launch them. And some of these missiles didn't have any launch control personnel there. When the Soviets went back, they found the hatches, the probably 20-ton hatches, removed. So the Soviet ICBM was exposed. And they found that some of the missiles, I think there were 3 of them, that had been manipulated, or there's been some kind of either an examination or some kind of tampering with a warhead on top of the missiles. The Soviets didn't realize this until some weeks later. They took it apart to figure out why it wasn't working, and every single operating component that would have caused a nuclear detonation was all disabled. And all 3 of them.
And all of them.
And how someone or something or some entity could do that without actually going down and taking the missile apart, the warhead apart to do that, is beyond explanation.
Well, it looks like to me they're trying to give us another message there.
Well, we know from past experiences that they did the same thing with our missile sites in Montana, in South Dakota, and North Dakota.
So what was the medical examination on these beings? What was the morphology that they found out?
The one that was died, that was shot, was examined very closely. X-rays were taken, samples were taken. And one of the things they found out was the suit, or maybe the skin, the outer texture of the ET, the entity, was in different layers. So they had to cut through, the Soviet pathologists had to cut through several different layers, and as according to our source, they weren't sure if they were cutting through skin or whether it was texture of some kind of a material. They didn't know. But they took samples of everything down to the actual organs. And the organs was one big organ, similar to what we knew about the Ebens, which was one organ, a heart and lung complex, something that resembled maybe a stomach or intestines. And they had white fluid in their system rather than our red, or we've seen entities with green fluid, but it had white fluid. The Soviet scientists or medical personnel, pathologists, it was unknown to them. One of the main things the Soviet scientists wanted to know was, were these things created, or were they were born like what our humans would be?
Yeah, were they grown like clones or programmed life forms? Are they, half machine, half organic? The fact that you mentioned all these layers, before you get to the organs, is very interesting. We've seen this in the projects a lot.
Yes, and I've seen it in when I worked for Association DARPA, that they had layers. And most of those with layers were the part humanoid and part robot and they weren't the actual entities that
Right.
were that had flesh and blood like we would consider a human.
Absolutely, I agree. So were they able to communicate ever with these extraterrestrials, or it's just they were unsuccessful with that?
They never were able to communicate. They tried everything. They even tried telepathy. They had some psychic or person come in from a local institute or something, and they weren't able to. These entities would just stand or sit and would be non-compliant. The Soviet personnel would give them instructions, sit down, or they were given food, they were given water, but the entities wouldn't touch the food or the water.
And were they okay with this atmosphere? Did they take the helmets off, leave them on?
No, one of the things that they didn't do, the Soviets didn't take the entities' helmets off because they figured if they did, it probably would kill them because they would have to breathe. But one of the things they couldn't understand was the little tank in the back was very, very small. It wasn't a large tank, it was a very small tank. And they survived several days just on that small tank. And they couldn't figure out what that was, or if it was regenerating itself inside the tank, like I talked about before, where these certain entities could feed themselves. And so they weren't sure if that was something biological or it was mechanical. But we never learned that. We learned our source was able to get us some photographs of the entities and photographs of the craft.
Do you have any videos or have seen videos of the interrogation or of the craft?
I personally didn't, but I knew we had them. That our U.S. intelligence service had a copy of the video, and I'm not sure if the video was an interrogation of the entities or if it was the actual incident. I mean, there were some pictures of the actual incident. I saw still pictures of the craft on the ground and several Soviet military vehicles around it, but I didn't see anything else other than that.
I mean, did you see any rivets, or was it seamless?
No, there was no seams, no rivets. The Soviet personnel went inside the craft, and the inside of the craft was very, very simple. There were places for the entities to sit. There were similar metal chairs. There wasn't any knobs, switches, or buttons inside the craft. There was a large monitor in front of the seats. There was a panel that had similar to handprints, and that's it. As if the entities sat in these chairs and put their hands in these printed areas or grooves and maybe flew the craft that way, or maybe through their mind. But there wasn't any other rooms or compartments.
It's just one big hollow space.
Yes, one.
And how many of these areas with the palms and seats did you see in the pictures?
4. There's just 4, and there were 4
of them.
entities. Yeah.
On the panels, we have 5 fingers. Was there any digits, that looked like that's where they put their hands into?
Just 4. They didn't have thumbs.
Okay, so there was 4 digits.
4 digits.
Okay.
4 grooves.
4 grooves.
4 grooves.
Okay.
And the only thing that, other than that, there were metal rods that ran from the ceiling of the craft down to the back of the chair. Each chair had this metal bar running, or some kind of a bar, and that's it. It was ironic. It was our analysts emphasized the fact that there wasn't any other rooms, little galleyways inside this craft. It was all one big area. Now, one of our scientists later on surmised that once it was on the ground, that's what we would see. But once it flew, these walls could be fluid, it could change shapes. We actually saw this in a captured craft that we recovered in Nevada years ago, that once it was powered up, things inside that craft changed appearances. And that's what they think that what occurred.
If you enjoyed this, make sure to watch the next video on AwakenZone. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, but you won't want to miss what's coming next.